Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. For those joining us live, thank you so much. It's the only show that will not be talking about an indictment of a former president going on right now. In fact, we're going to talk about what's happening in the world, and there's a lot happening. First of all, we'll look at Israel, where Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, having taken the country to the brink of a civil crisis, perhaps even a civil war, blinked earlier this week. Then we'll go to France, where protests on the streets continue in the aftermath of an effort by the French president to change the pension laws. Then we'll take a look at the visit of the Taiwanese president to the United States and what that is going to do for U.S. relations with China. And finally, a look at Xi Jinping's summit with Vladimir Putin last week in Moscow. Here to talk about all of these issues are Bobby Ghosh, who is an opinion editor at Bloomberg. Bobby, great to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
Also here, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who is the China reporter for Axios. She's joining us from Taipei. Bethany, great to have you.
Great to be here.
Anton La Guardia is the diplomatic editor of The Economist based in Washington, D.C. Anton, great to have you back.
Great to be with you.
And Roger Cohen is chief correspondent based in Paris for the New York Times. He's joining us from Alabama. And he's also the author of An Affirming Flame, Meditations on Life and Politics, a book that is just out. Congrats on that, Roger, and great to have you here as well.
Thank you, Ivo.
Bobby, let's start with you. Israel, over last weekend, things exploded, I think is the only way you can describe what was happening in the country. And Benjamin Netanyahu was faced with a big and fundamental choice, and he decided that, as he put it, dialogue is preferable to civil war, and stood down from his efforts to change the judiciary, the way the judiciary operates in Israel. Just bring us up to date about what caused the explosion, but then secondly, where do you think Netanyahu is heading? Because it's not like the problems that he was trying to address before aren't going have just suddenly gone away.
Yeah, listen, since you started by promising viewers that we would not discuss the potential the indictment of a former president, it's a little awkward because we're now talking about a potential indictment of a sitting prime minister. That's where all these problems begin. Netanyahu, who is facing criminal charges, wants to muzzle the Israeli judicial system. His far-right partners in his governing coalition, for a variety of different reasons, have that same objective. And what we saw over several months since his government was elected in December was sustained and strong protests across the country every weekend. Hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes running into 500,000 in Jerusalem alone, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, coming out in protest against this. Israel doesn't have a written constitution. The judiciary is the check and balance to the power of the executive, and a lot of Israelis would like to keep it that way. It was a big test for Israeli democracy. For decades now, as all of us on this program know, Israeli leaders have made this point, somewhat specious, that Israel is the only true democracy in the Middle East. Well, we can debate that, but certainly Israeli society, as we've seen, has very strong democratic impulses. And the protests were peaceful, they were strong, and in the final sort of blow to Netanyahu, they were joined by civil society organizations, by unions, including the civil service unions, all of which basically called for him to back down. And he also got a phone call from Joe Biden asking him to do the same thing. Now, he has backed down, kinda, he said that he would hold off for now. If we learned anything about Netanyahu over the years, is that he keeps coming back, and I suspect that he will go away. Take this whole reform package, cut it into little bits, and then come back and try to push through legislation addressing small parts of it. And then that'll be the test of whether all those hundreds of thousands of people who came out against the full package, whether they will feel similarly inclined for bits and pieces of the package, and whether this protests will be sustained when he tries to do it that way.
So a real test, Anton, a real test for democracy, and it seems to me in Israel. You reported from there quite a while ago, but you do know the country, and I guess the question is, can the society be remobilized if Bobby is right, and I suspect he is, that Netanyahu will come back after Passover and the Independence holidays recess for Parliament and try to get what he wants, which is a fundamental reform of the Constitution. How do you think this is going to play out?
I think that he will hope that the opposition has abated. He will try, as Bobby says, to chop it up, to try to make it harder for people to coalesce against him. But it must be said, this is an extraordinary loss of political touch by the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history. He served longer than David Ben-Gurion. So, this is a man who was known by his devotees as the king or the magician, and he suddenly pulled out of his hat, not a rabbit, but a bomb that's blown up in his face. So how he gets out of it is very difficult. If he persists in pursuing the reform, he will probably, no doubt, get another wave of protests. And in effect, a strike by some of the most important military reservists, pilots, cyber warriors, and the rest of it. And if he backs down, he could have a revolt in his own ranks, particularly from the right wing of his very right-wing coalition. So it doesn't look good for him at the moment.
He's certainly in a box, partly of his own creation, of course, because he is, as you said, relying on that right-wing part of the Israeli political spectrum to be and remain in power and possibly out of prison. Roger, you're normally located in Europe, and it's been interesting to watch that the criticism of Netanyahu has tended to come from the United States, and particularly quietly and increasingly publicly by the President of the United States. What are the Europeans saying about what's happening, and how do they think this is going to play out?
Well, there has been some criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu from President Macron. The finance minister of Israel was in Paris about 10 days ago, and he declared that there is no such thing as the Palestinian people. And now this was at a private dinner, but the word came out, and it seemed like we'd gone back a half century or so to Golda Meir and even before then, and that everything that has happened in the interim has simply been forgotten by this very far-right government. So I think there is a lot of uneasiness, criticism in Europe of what Bibi Netanyahu has been trying to do. I was very struck by the rumblings in the military in Israel. I think that was a very important factor and very unusual when you have elite units of the Israeli military showing unhappiness over what was happening, and even outgoing flights from Tel Aviv airport shut down. I think it had reached proportions perhaps unlike the strikes and demonstrations in France. It had reached such a level that he probably had no choice but to step back. And we will see what happens going forward. I'm also struck by the fact that millions of voters, both in the United States and in Israel, don't seem to care about the legal problems, the accusations, whether it's against Trump or Netanyahu. I mean, I was in the Knesset almost 2 years ago, 50 feet from Netanyahu when he was voted out of office. And having written about what I thought of him, that was quite a moment for me. And the idea that he would be back within a short period of time, to me, is quite extraordinary. And And it shows the essentially rightward drift of Israeli society.
Certainly looks that way, and it looks like these cats in fact do have multiple political lives, as it seems. Bethany, just to wrap it up, the crisis was set off, or not the crisis. The crisis was set off by the judicial reform, but the explosion was set off by Netanyahu's firing of the defense minister, who had come out publicly to say that we needed to halt this process because the security of the state of Israel was at stake. This morning, the New York Times reports that the defense minister is still going to work every day. Seems to be not yet have received the letter that makes his firing officially. And there is this dilemma that that Netanyahu has, that he fired someone which led to a crisis which forced his hand, and now he needs to decide, do I follow through or not? And at the same time, there is all kinds of other discussions with other members of the coalition about setting up parallel paramilitaries or national guards. Should we be worried about the security of the state of Israel at this stage?
You're directing this question at me.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not an Israel expert. I'm not really sure I can sound in on that one.
Well, Bobby, let me.
I'll take a whack at it. I mean, I think we should be concerned about the proposals to set up yet another armed group of people answering to an extreme right interior minister. Israel is already one of the most militarized societies in the world. The notion that there's another security apparatus being set up is really quite frightening. And against all of this in the foreground, remember, there is the background of what's still going on with the Palestinians, who, I mean, the last thing they want to hear is another armed group. Essentially, you know, if what the reporting out of Israel is to be believed, essentially formalizing what are already existing informal militias of people and just giving them the license to kill, which is hardly something to be optimistic about. So yes, we should be worried about about what's going on within Israel, and Biden's very strong comments reflects that anxiety within the United States. You know, within the Israeli, within the Jewish American population, there are very strong feelings, but more and more you're hearing voices speaking out against Netanyahu, against this drift in Israeli society. And I fear that there'll be a lot more of it.
Well, we'll be watching it closely because this story is not going to go away. And another story, Roger, that has not gone away is protests on the French streets. There were massive protests in the run-up to the parliamentary debate and possible vote on the pension change law, which for, I guess, Americans and many in Europe seemed to be relatively modest, but for many in France was certainly 2 or 3 steps too far. The pension law went through in a sleight of hand, I think is the best way to describe it, but I'll let you talk about it. And the protests continue, and Macron seems to be stuck and having to face the reality that he's governing with many people back out on the street in the same way that he faced in his first term. How should we think about what he faces and what's happening in France more generally?
Yes, Ivo, it's been a different kind of spring in Paris with reeking garbage all over the place, uncollected, because the garbage service in Paris has been on strike. There have been strikes and demonstrations now for over 10 weeks, as you say. Most of Europe, Italy, retirement age 67, Netherlands heading that way, Spain too, Germany almost 66, and Emmanuel Macron trying to raise the retirement age to 64 from 62. And as you said, that may not seem that big a deal, but then this is France. And France is very attached to its system, its economic system, its economic model with a great deal of social solidarity. And there's a feeling that work, the word work, travail in French, has a negative connotation. The word work in the United States, we work, great wealth, can do, it's generally positive. But for many French people, and by no means all, there are a lot of very hardworking French people, they feel that this was a step too far. They can't say they didn't know it was coming. Emmanuel Macron had a very vague campaign platform for his re-election last April, but he did make very clear in the last debate with Marine Le Pen that he intended to raise the retirement age to 65. He's in fact compromised on that and lowered it to 64. And nonetheless, a couple of weeks later, he was re-elected with 59% of the vote. The thing is that evidently a lot of those 59% did not like the idea of the raising of the retirement age, but they disliked even more the idea of electing a far-right, xenophobic, anti-immigrant leader in Marine Le Pen. And so the election went the way that it did. I think the president has mismanaged this. The message has not been clear. He tried to come back to it last week saying, I feel this is my responsibility. Our finances, you cannot have fewer and fewer people supporting more and more retirees who are now living into their 80s, even 90s. Under the French system, those who are working essentially pay for the pensions of those who are not. And France spent over 100 billion on COVID, public finances in a difficult situation. But the messaging has been very unclear. At one moment, it's been that. It's been portrayed as a left-wing reform. And Macron, having discovered with the Yellow Vest movement in 2019, protest movement, that he was regarded as aloof, and said he got the message, appears to many French people to have returned to that quasi-monarchical aloofness, which of course is built into the Constitution of the Fifth Republic because de Gaulle wanted that way. And the reason that, a bit like what happened in Israel with the defense minister, the crowning element in this was his decision at the last minute, with his government having said it would not resort to this, to use a measure that is known as the 49.3, because that is the article in the Constitution, to ram through the reform without an actual vote on the bill. Now, this is legal. It is a measure allowed by the French Constitution. And what happens is that you ram it through, but you have to expose the government to a no-confidence vote. And if the no-confidence vote goes against the government, then the government falls and the bill falls. But of course, voting on the survival of a government and voting on a single bill are two very different things. One carries much greater weight. And that is precisely what Macron was gambling on, because a lot of the center-right Republicans did not want an election. So he got the measure, but he was taking an enormous social risk, because this is something that had become extremely important to a lot of French people. Surveys show 2/3 of people in France are opposed to this. And to have it pushed through in that way added insult to injury, with the result that there's been a further wave of protests. And essentially the situation now is who's going to blink. Is it possible that President Macron will, as some unions are suggesting, go for a 6-month pause where it can be negotiated, or take some other step with regard to the bill? Or will the protest simply run out of steam because, your pay gets docked every time you go on strike? And there were fewer people in the street this week than there were in the previous week. I do not think personally that Macron, knowing him as I do, I don't think he's going to retreat from this. So I think we can foresee several weeks, perhaps months even, of further protests. The Constitutional Court is going to rule on the measure April 14. So we'll see what it has to say about the legality of what happened.
It's a fascinating play, and it's a very different set of circumstances than in Israel and others, and yet it is, Anton, something that we're seeing in more and more democratic societies. People distrusting their leaders, their institutions, the establishment, because they view them acting in ways that are no longer controlled by the people. They are doing it in Macron's case, for a case that he has tried to make, so it's not really to his own benefit, but against very much the wishes of the own people. And it does raise this question about where does democracy go when people decide that, when they don't like a particular policy, even a policy that the person who was elected said they were going to do, they'll take to the streets and try to take the government down. What does this mean for the stability of our democracies around the world? And it's not the only two places where this is happening.
So democracy is under threat and contested in lots of different places and in lots of different ways. I think the French case is a sort of particular French example. There is a tradition of revolt and of la rue, the street, compelling leaders to backtrack on things that are unpopular. Pension reform is a particular bone of contention, going back all the way to Chirac, who tried to pass it, had to back down. De Villepin tried it and had to back down, and Macron's trying again. The reality is that French public finances spend a huge amount on public pensions. About 14% of GDP goes onto public pensions, which is about twice the OECD average. So part of leadership is, of course, to listen to your constituents and to the elected. And part of the leadership is also to sometimes take unpopular and difficult decisions that are for the general good. So my own view is that on this one, he's right in the substance, but he's doing poorly on the presentation and the politics of it, particularly the move to the Article 49.3 has been particularly contentious. By the way, it's been used 100 times before. It's not as if it's a rare and unusual thing to do. It is part of French politics, as it is, by the way, in Italian politics. Lots of bills pass through as confidence motions as the only way to get business done. But nevertheless, this was seen as a sort of coup de main against democracy. I mean, part of me has a grudging admiration for the French and their sort of dogged defense of the right to leisure. I mean, they have among the longest retirements of anybody in rich countries. It's gone from about 12 years in 1970 to about 20 odd years, 25 odd years right now. I will retire at 65 or 67 and, would very much like not to. But that's life of longevity. I expect other people on this call as well probably feel the same way. This is a country that has a 35-hour working week and all the rest of it. So, someone is going to have to pay for it in some way at some point. That's the problem. You can't defer it indefinitely. You will have a crisis of the public finances at some point, or you'll have a bond run, or, there will be, an economic crisis will hit France, and, there will be a reckoning at some point.
If I may, I've spent last couple of weeks, I've had several conversations with a couple of very close friends who are on the other side of this argument, who are on the other side of the barricades and are protesting or striking. And here's their argument. And this is not to say that I buy it. Their argument is when Americans like me scoff at their resistance to just a 2-year delay in retirement, they say, look, we don't get paid as well as you guys. We get paid crappy salaries. We pay very high taxes. And this is the compact we have with the government. This is the compact we've had with the state, that this is what we'll get in exchange for low salaries and high taxes. just because we retire at 62 doesn't mean we stop working at 62. Many of us are not going to be able to make ends meet at that stage and have to continue to work in some fashion. We may be drawing pensions, but we still have to keep we need other sources of income in order to sustain our lifestyle. So that's the argument from the other side. It's worth thinking about that for just a second.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Bobby. I mean, you talk to the French about what other societies are doing, and they say, "Mais oui, okay, mais nous, on est la France," and they're not particularly impressed by it, and they feel they have a work-life balance that is appropriate. They have a strong feeling about the role of the state and the way the state should protect. They are deeply skeptical always of what they call le capitalisme anglo-saxon, Anglo-Saxon capitalism. And they have a point. I would much rather be poor in France than poor in the United States. There is a degree of social protection in France that is pretty much unique. And I was wandering yesterday through Atlanta Airport and seeing the various places I could get a shoe shine, that it's impossible to get a shoe shine in France. There is no such thing. And why is that? That is because the idea for a French citizen of somebody at their feet cleaning their shoes is irreconcilable with their notion of human dignity, if you like, or of the same way in France, if you ask somebody something, but do not start with bonjour, monsieur, or bonjour, madame, they will immediately correct you and stop and will not answer, because that, again, is just seeing another human being in front of you. So this is something, Macron, the reason why, as Anton was saying, this goes back many, many, many years, is that there's a deep sea. It's much more than about, two extra years of working, and a lot of French people work a lot more than that anyway. But it's about, I think the word you used, Bobby, compact, is a very good one. There is this compact, and any attack on it, or perceived attack on it, is virulently contested. I think Macron has also suffered. The sheen is off. He was the golden boy, the Wunderkind, in 2017. He burst on the scene. And now the meaning of his second term, what it's about, he destroyed the center right and the center left in France, and he occupies the entire center. And all there is extreme right and extreme left, and he no longer has a parliamentary majority, and he has 4 more years in power. So what's he going to do with it? That question has been posed in the last several weeks.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it's also probably right to just add to what Bobby and Roger just said. In order to get a full pension, you currently have to work 40 years. So if you retire at 62, that means you have to have full work since 22. And I think under the new law, it's 41 years. And that full pension is also, it's not 100% of your salary. I think it's, 50%? Is that right, Roger?
75, usually.
75%, in order to get that.
But the salaries are lower, as was pointed out. Yeah.
So it is more complicated than it seems and looks in the way I think we sometimes talk about it. The issue, Roger, that you raised at the end, what about the next 4 years? A good question. We're going to come back to that at another stage. Right now, we're going to look at Anton at a visit of the Taiwanese president to the United States. She will be here twice. She's in New York right now. Come back to LA next week. Is expected to meet with Speaker McCarthy. The Chinese are saying, what happened last time when the Speaker of the House met with the President of Taiwan, and they're threatening to do the same. Why is she coming? And what should we expect the reaction to be?
Well, it bears watching closely. Transits by so-called transits, because they're not visits to the United States, they're transits. She's on her way somewhere else. And that somewhere else is Central America. And why is she going to Guatemala and Belize? Because they are 2 of just 13 countries that still recognize Taiwan rather than China as the legitimate Chinese state. And that number is dwindling. The Chinese earlier this month took another card away when Honduras, by flipping Honduras. So anyway, she's going to tend that relationship. And she passes through the United States, which, as everybody knows, is still the main protector of Taiwan, guaranteeing the status quo, which is as a kind of de facto but not de jure independent entity that is a kind of leftover from the Chinese Civil War. These transits have caused trouble in the past. They were the cause of one previous Taiwan Strait crisis. So far, so quiet. She's visiting New York. She goes away. Watch when she comes back, because in Los Angeles, she's supposed to meet Kevin McCarthy. Now, and everybody will remember what trouble the visit by Nancy Pelosi to the island itself caused last year, when there was repeated volleys of missiles closer to Taiwan than in the past, bracketing the island, flying over Taipei. And the danger is that you will see some kind of turning of the ratchet again on this occasion. Although admittedly, speaking to her in Los Angeles is different from going to Taiwan itself. But I think the Chinese are in a different mood these days. They're much more easily provoked. They keep using this phrase that says those who play with fire shall, perish by it, which sounds extremely threatening. And I am struck by the mirror image of that in the United States, which is the ease and casualness almost with which people talk about the prospect of war with China over Taiwan. The military and intelligence people have hardened their view that 2027 is the target date by which Xi Jinping wants to have the capacity to invade Taiwan, at least have the capacity. They'll not necessarily do it, but he wants the option. Some generals have started circulating orders saying, be ready for 2025. Military spending in the Pacific is increasing. The Japanese have just announced a doubling of their defense spending. The Philippines have just announced that the Americans will be able to use more bases. The Chinese talk of a sense of encirclement. And this has all echoes of, the run-up to war in the 1930s to an extent. And I was recently in the Pacific visiting various American military outposts in Okinawa and in Guam and in Hawaii to get a sense of how the U.S. military is thinking about this, coming war. And there's some very interesting concepts around, how to avoid giving the Chinese an easy target to fire at by scattering and dispersing across the various island chains. It sounds all very good on paper. Making it happen in reality is really hard. It requires incredibly good computer networks that are both able to connect up distant shooters and sensors. It requires, and to be resilient to cyber attack, it requires incredible logistics to support these dispersed packets of troops. And it requires a degree of coordination with allies that it won't be certain until the day war happens, if it ever happens, because most of it would be fought on territory that's not American. So a lot needs to go right for the United States. If it does, Taiwan needs to fight in the same way as Ukraine did. It has to defend itself to give its friends time to help. But an island is both harder to invade and harder to support. And any war would be incredibly destructive. So the question for policymakers, I think, is how to increase deterrence without increasing provocation. And I think that requires cool head and the ability to do things that matter to sort of increase the defense of Taiwan and avoiding too many symbolic acts that only rile up the Chinese for no very great gain.
I think you set up the dilemma, I think, for the policymakers exactly right. And Bethany, as someone who reports from Taiwan, and is in some ways the object of this competition between the United States military and intelligence, at least, if not actually the U.S. Writ large, and of course China. How is the president's visit being transit, as Anton rightly puts it, being seen, and how worried are people in responsibility, as well as people on the street, about what the Chinese reaction might be?
Sure. So if we want to compare this to last year, I know I was on the ground last year here in Taipei when Nancy Pelosi came. Everybody was talking about it. This was the big news. The whole island was just riveted with her arrival. It was, the highest ranking U.S. official to come in more than 25 years. This is nothing like that. I think the average Taiwanese person, they probably know that Tsai is in the U.S. They may know that she's probably going to meet with McCarthy, but it is nowhere near that level of excitement. I think the feeling was, to have someone come to Taiwan was the huge thing that got people so excited. However, that's the person on the street. The politicos here, government officials, foreign government officials, foreign diplomats, are watching this extremely closely and are very concerned and have gotten more and more concerned over the past 5 days about what China's reaction might be. Now, from kind of a logical perspective or just a historical perspective, one would think that Tsai meeting with Kevin McCarthy in California would really be nowhere near the level of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. But there's a couple of factors that we should consider when we're talking about what China's reaction might be. And the first one is that what we've seen from the Chinese Communist Party, from Xi Jinping in the past few years, is that the red lines keep getting, bigger, broader and broader and broader. More and more and more things cross the red lines. Or from Taiwan's perspective, the space that they're allowed to occupy on the global stage is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So we're not looking at a single, non-moving red line. It's a moving target. And so, it's entirely possible that the Chinese government could choose to react in just as strong of a way, an extreme of a way as they did last year, because they want to keep moving that target. They want to keep constricting Taiwan space. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is that Nancy Pelosi was very clearly on her way out, both of her position as Speaker of the House and in her career, just kind of on her way out, a setting sun. McCarthy, on the other hand, is a rising star. He's just starting out his position as House Speaker. He has a lot of momentum going forward. So it's much more influential for Tsai to meet with him. So these are the two considerations, perhaps from Beijing's perspective, why they might have a stronger reaction than we might expect. People here, so people, not average people, but people whose job it is to do this, are revving up a bit to see, how China might react. If I had a guess, I would say we're not going to see huge military exercises, but rather, other forms of diplomatic pressure. So Beijing just, poached Honduras. Maybe they might try to take another nation in response if Tsai does meet with McCarthy. Also, it could depend on how public their meeting is and what Tsai says in the meeting with McCarthy. If there's a press conference afterwards, these might affect, how Beijing reacts. There's something else too I want to sort of bring up, is that it's actually a fascinating kind of situation right now. There's dual meetings going on. So Ma Ying-jeou, the former president of Taiwan, who was Tsai's predecessor, now he's KMT, much more comfortable with close relations with Beijing. It was Tsai's election, as the head of the DPP, the much more Beijing skeptical party, that prompted Beijing to cut off communications with Taiwan a number of years ago, and which they have maintained ever since. And that is, really when Beijing began this most recent kind of campaign of poaching all these diplomatic allies and other measures to constrain Taiwan's space on the world stage. So former President Ma Ying-jeou is in China right now. It's the first time that a former Taiwanese president has ever visited China. And he has not been quiet about it. He had a big public meeting with the head of the Taiwan Affairs Office, which someone has snarkily remarked is, the person who's in charge of conquering Taiwan, basically. So we have these dueling meetings, and you could look at them as different visions for who is going to guarantee Taiwan's security. The DPP is, of course, all up in arms about Mine Zhou going out to China. Tsai is obviously looking to the West, looking to the U.S. But people who are pro-KMT here in Taiwan, now they don't want unification with China, but there are plenty of people who are pro-KMT who are comfortable with closer relations with China, who believe that if they stop provoking China, if they allow closer trade, that will make it a safer situation for Taiwan. Now, I personally don't think that makes sense, because getting close to the person who's threatening you isn't going to make you safe. But anyway, that's the perspective here. So this is an interesting set of dueling high-level meetings here.
I'm very glad that you brought that up, Bethany, because I was thinking a former president is in one place and another on the way back to the United States soon, which does set up the sort of the dynamic that is also Taiwanese politics that is playing out, and we're having a presidential election. Next year? In which these two streams of thinking will compete for political power. But I want to end, and we have a few more minutes here, and Bobby ask you, and then come to Roger finally on the point that both Anton and Bethany have raised. I mean, we are, it looks like, a spiraling situation in which the United States domestic politics is kind of forcing the administration and everyone else to, when they have a choice between a softer and a harder line, to take the harder line. And the Chinese at the same time are forced for their own domestic reasons to do the same thing. The kind of rhetoric we're hearing in the past few months, particularly striking given that Xi and Biden seem to have a pretty good meeting in Bali in November. How worried should we be about this, really spiraling out of control? It reminds, Anton talked about the 1930s. I often think about this as the 1950s. We are, and on Capitol Hill, the description of the Chinese, who are now the Chinese Communist Party, is not that different from what you heard about the Red Chinese back in the 1950s. How worried, when you sit watching Washington, from your perch in New York, how worried should we be about this?
Well, I think we should be worried because there is rising hostility on both sides. If this was happening on one side primarily, then that would be concerning in itself. But the fact that it's happening on both sides makes it really quite alarming. And I've been traveling to other parts of the world where this anxiety is being felt by people who feel like they're caught between two giant forces that are sort of almost inexorably heading towards conflict with enormous consequences for everybody else in the world. The expression Thucydides' trap keeps coming up over and over in conversations like you wouldn't believe. So yeah, we should be very, very concerned, and it would take an act of great statesmanship from either side to step back from the brink, and it doesn't look like Xi Jinping is going to do that. And I frankly can't imagine Joe Biden either. So, yeah, as they say, be afraid, be very afraid.
Roger, an act of great statesmanship. Turns out there is a statesman just about to go to Beijing. Emmanuel Macron is going to on a trip to Beijing next week. He will take with him the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who's just given a major speech on what she thinks the Europeans' relationship with China should be. She's slightly in a different position than her the other EU president counterpart, Charles Michel. She's more hardline. But how do you think Macron's going to handle this visit? Because he, presumably, like everyone else, has no interest in this U.S. China relations spiraling out of control and taking away Europeans' ability to act independently.
No, that's right, Ivo. And he talks a lot about Europuissance, European power, Europe as a power, as a geostrategic power. A little less since the war in Ukraine, because that has demonstrated yet again how even the United Europe is still so dependent on the United States, at least for military supplies. He will try to chart some kind of middle path. The Europeans do not want an out-and-out decoupling confrontation between the United States and China. The German auto industry alone is, I think, 40% dependent or something on the Chinese market. The French want to develop economic opportunities in China. So I think he will try to mediate in some way, or at least avoid the worst scenarios that Anton, in somewhat blood-chilling, I found, fashion, was outlining. I mean, the U.S. military talks about dispersing its targets and a lot of high-tech things, but behind all that, there are a lot of dead people, and there is a world in complete and utter turmoil. If on top of the war in Ukraine, which I think is going to go on for a while, we get war in Asia, all bets are off. It's a very, I have to agree with Bobby, it's a very combustible moment. Defense budgets are going up everywhere. And you now have this arc, Russia, China, and I would add Iran. That is a vast landmass. And it's a vast anti-Western, anti-American landmass that is now taking solid form and moving, as the arrest of the Wall Street Journal correspondent in Russia illustrated, in a more and more confrontational direction. It's not the Cold War, because we're all connected now in a way we were not in the 20th century. Everything is interlinked, interwoven, and networked, and maybe that is some kind of break on the worst. But it does look pretty ominous to me right now. I mean, my book is called An Affirming Flame because I grew up in South Africa, and the worst was always predicted. And then we had this, my relatives were always telling me, you know, the swimming pools will be red with blood next year. And then lo and behold, this extraordinary act of statesmanship from Mandela and de Klerk. And we shouldn't forget that leadership can still avert the worst and reaffirm hope. So I'm not completely despairing.
That's a nice place to end, Roger. A bit of optimism, an affirming flame in that way. We hope you're right. We all hope you're right. But we will have to leave it there. And I'm sorry, Bethany, we didn't get to the Putin issue, but we did get to the core of the matter, which is the confrontation between those two powers and the West, and the problems that causes for everyone, including not least the Taiwanese. I want to thank Roger Cohen, Bobby Ghosh, Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, and Anton La Guardia for really a terrific conversation. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review, and until then, have a wonderful weekend.